global company. I look after Sub-Saharan Africa, manage the Sub-Saharan Africa sales, and also our office that's based in Centurion.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Groom. I work for NEC Exxon, and basically Exxon started as a systems integrator about 25 years ago, and NEC bought into them and now own 51% majority. So NEC is the Japanese corporation, and my role is basically pre-sales and supplying networking equipment to various ISPs and enterprise customers.
Hi, I'm Andrew Alston. I work for Liquid Intelligent Technologies, large Pan-African ISP. In my role, I am CTO of our R&D division, which means that we're developing various products, everything from our own routing platforms, firewalls, monitoring systems, etc. And I head up that whole R&D division inside Liquid Labs, which is a subdivision of Liquid Intelligent Technologies.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. In case you've been living under a rock for the last 12 months or so, we can't get kit anymore. There's some excuse or other, and I suppose the first question to the panel is, why are we struggling? In your view, is it a war or is it a war? Obviously, let's start with you.
Sure. Sure, thanks, Mark.
I mean, you're not representing Cisco.
Yeah, no, sure. I'll just speak from a general OEM point of view. So I think the cause of where we are right now is mainly due to probably a logistics and risk management issue. The OEM supply chains, they're not as, well, they've been proven and exposed not to be as resilient and as failure tolerant as they should be. And this is because of maybe 2 or 3 reasons, right? The first one, am I audible? Okay. The first one is that if you look at the structure of the semiconductor market, right, you find that there's just a handful of players on the planet that are suppliers and manufacturers of silicon or semiconductors. So all OEMs across industry verticals in the world can only go to a select few of these guys to procure, right? The second thing is that most OEMs, including Cisco, they have a JIT, a just-in-time manufacturing approach to logistics. They manufacture as and when they get orders, they produce just enough to meet demand, and they don't hold safe inventory stock, right? Now that leaves OEMs at a risk and exposed to vulnerabilities that would be affecting their upstream providers, which in this case would be your Intel, Samsung, TSMC, etc. So I think it's more of a risk management issue than it is a COVID-19 issue. It's just that COVID-19 in this case is the event, or it's what triggered the whole thing. But tomorrow it may well be a natural disaster, it could be a global financial crisis, it could be a geopolitical conflict even. TSMC today has about 53% market share in global semiconductor supply. Now think of a situation wherein TSMC was in Ukraine today, or China decides to invade Taiwan, which is where TSMC is. So it's a risk management issue than it is a COVID-19 issue.
Ooh. From one vendor to the other. Barry, it seems like you disagree.
Yeah, let me talk next. So, look, I agree that the main contributing factor has been COVID. With shutdowns, fabrication shutdowns in the East, which is 75% of the semiconductors do come from South Korea, Taiwan, China, and Japan. Obviously, so those shutdowns have affected us. One of the ways that Infinera has tried to combat that is that we're one of the few companies that manufacture our own indium phosphate optical semiconductors in the US. We've got a factory in California, so that's one of the reasons we're trying to combat that at the moment as well. But there's a couple of things that it's not just the actual manufacturing facilities. What we've also seen is that a lot of companies have also panic buyed. They panic buy, which is obviously causing more shortages, which is causing more problems in the market as well. Also, what's happening because of all the shutdowns, the shutdowns in the fabrication facilities, technology hasn't slowed down. So technology hasn't slowed down. 5G rollouts are still going ahead. There's more cloud applications coming in. There's more IoT. The drought in Taiwan, which no one could foresee. And also what perfect storm hit us because the US sanctions on China, 15% of semiconductors came from China. So COVID hit as the sanctions were coming into China, so it was just a perfect storm, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, you think this answer's a bit too safe. I feel like you want to blow it up.
No, I think that from my perspective, I've done quite a bit of looking at this. You do have a bit of a perfect storm. You've had COVID. You've got the drought in Taiwan. You then had Vladimir Putin, who decided to invade the Ukraine, and a lot of people don't realize this, but to manufacture chips, you need neon gas. Most of the neon gas comes out of Ukraine. So now we've got a neon gas shortage that's starting to impact this as well. And this kind of perfect storm, you've also got the logistics issues. At one point, they were sitting with something like 1,000 ships parked off, the coast of Shanghai that were unable to leave anywhere because, they just couldn't ship because of COVID issues and the rest of it. So even if they could make it, they couldn't get the chips out, et cetera, from a shipping perspective, so that also impacted it. But at the same time, you refer to the panic buying. There's been an interesting situation where you've also got certain major vendors that were relying on manufacture of silicon who then went and bought a whole bunch of it to try and mitigate this. And in particular, NVIDIA. NVIDIA stocked up rather nicely to cater for the crypto mining market. And well, we all know what happened to the crypto mining market when the crypto fell out. And now they've actually got an oversupply in certain parts. And the net result of it, NVIDIA lost 8% of their stock value on Friday. Thanks, NVIDIA. But so it's a complex issue. And I do think that some vendors, through their stocking, et cetera, managed to weather this a lot better than others. There was an interesting report out in the Wall Street Journal put out an interesting article about the predictions on stock prices between Juniper, Arista, and Cisco, and came to the conclusion that Juniper and Arista had covered themselves better than Cisco, which was affecting Cisco's stock price. Not my words, that's Wall Street Journal's words. So it is, there's planning component to this as well, and I think some vendors did plan for this and prepare for it better than others.
Ben, is it that complex an issue? Is the suffering that hard?
I'm not sure that I'm terribly qualified to talk about what's causing it. Certainly one of the impacts of this. One of the things that I think is difficult to appreciate from the perspective of a consumer of this type of equipment rather than a manufacturer or assembler is why the effects of this seem to have such a long tail. I don't have a problem talking about stuff that I'm unqualified to do, but I try not to do it into a microphone if I can help it.
We're recording, just so you know.
I know. You're always recording, dude. You've got an iPhone. I think one of the, but I think that two things that are difficult, and this is not helped by the quality of the communication that's come out of the vendor community about this, is why this crunch that occurred now, best part of 2 years ago was the worst of it, as far as I understand. Why this seems to have such a long tail, and is it exacerbated because there is so much diversity in terms of stock keeping units in the vendors? Is this why, for example, Cisco and Juniper as the larger of the IP equipment vendors seem to be worse affected by the others? Is it because of diversity of stock? Or is it simply because we were running the whole supply chain so hot, even before COVID, that we simply don't have any headroom in order to draw down the backlog? That seems to be the obvious explanation to me, but I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say. As I understand it, there's no immediate prospect of this returning to normal. And so from my perspective, I think we need to change the conversation a little bit and stop focusing on how we can move past it and go back to a world in which we can, get hold of whatever we want in, 2 or 3 months, and start focusing on how we as a whole ecosystem can get better at planning. Because the problems that we've experienced have not been about unavailability of equipment per se. We've mostly had to do a bit of scrambling, but we've managed to mostly work around that on our own. The really difficult to manage problems have been around trying to plan on the basis of bad information. It's just as hard to plan for something that arrives 6 months earlier than you were anticipating it as it is to plan around it
6 months later.
Arriving 6 months later. And we've had that happen. We've had both happen in the same order in the last 12 months. And I think rather than dwelling on what the problem is and when, in 5 years' time can we move past it, I think we should be talking as an industry about how do we get better at working in a world where, standard lead times are less predictable and are certainly much, much longer.
Werner, I see you are nodding your head.
Yeah, I think Benny is 100% correct. The supply chain was under strain even before COVID hit. And as you said as well, we were relying on just-in-time orders. And then, this perfect storm hits this already under constrained supply chain, and it just destabilized the whole system. And then came, there was a winter storm in Texas, there was the drought in Japan, 2 cooling plants or actually plants that produce fluorescent in Europe or Belgium was also shut down, 2 plants from 3M. Just a bunch of things happened. And then it's not just the networking industry that's being hit by this. There's multiple industries. There's the motor manufacturing industry. And then all of a sudden you're competing against countries because they're relying on these economies. If you think about Japan that relies on their motor manufacturing, they're calling in for their piece of the cake. And that makes it very difficult.
Ryan, from your side, do you care about any of this, or will you take it as it comes?
No, I care very much, actually. It keeps me up at night. So I think what I've heard everybody say is kind of you've had, in the past 2 years, you've had a demand shock with COVID and people buying more PCs and gaming and all these electronics and phones, and then you've had a supply shock, which is all the COVID constraints and all the things we've talked about. So at a very macro level, you've got the perfect storm that's been mentioned. But I think also continuing on the macro level and moving towards this long tail and what are we going to do about it, I think things are about to change at a high level. You've got a softening of demand. People are going back to the office. The demand for phones and PCs and electronics has actually decreased since the last 2 years. Also, on the manufacturing side, I read a stat this morning about $90 billion went into manufacturing capacity factories to manufacture chips and things like that. And there was another $230 billion planned for 2022 and 2023. It takes about 12 to 18 months to bring that capacity online. So now what we're seeing, or we're going to see, is a huge amount of new capacity coming into the market, and a softening of demand, and also the global economy is starting to cool off. So that will also reduce demand. And that's why Andrew's NVIDIA shares have dropped a little bit, is because people can see the drop in demand and increase in supply. And I think a lot of the chip companies' share prices have gone down for that reason. So that's the kind of, there's a light at the end of the tunnel in my mind at a macro level. At an industry level, I think the long tail is a real problem. I think there's a huge backlog with the vendors, and the vendors can say that here. I think that in particular in Africa, we might fall towards the end of the queue in terms of our buying power. I think these big countries who depend on it, depend on these industries, these massive buyers of chips in the various industries. There's going to be a queue, and that queue for chips is going to be based on who has the biggest checkbook. And that's where we're going to fit in the long tail. And I think part of our challenge is how do we move up the queue in the backlog. But ultimately, I think we'll return to some normality. But it's not imminent. And as operators, I think we might have been a bit lucky. Even us, we kind of, as WIOCC, we saw it coming a little bit, and we overspent. We didn't panic buy, but we pulled a year's capex forward. We made a quick decision. We said, look, we're going to spend this cash next year on equipment. Let's spend it now because we can't. It made sense. But I think that window is closed now, and we're going to affect the impact of the delay is going to affect us, and we'll come to cable systems and stuff maybe later in the discussion. But let's stop there.
I mean, Dave, as someone who sits in between the OEMs and the customer, how would you explain this situation? I mean, you either have control either ways or you don't.
Yes, so from our perspective, obviously COVID was the catalyst, and what we saw was a lot of the smaller ISPs almost panic buying because they saw such an increase in traffic and utilization on the network with everyone working from home. And we had many requests from customers for security solutions and VPN solutions, and normally that would be planned, but obviously it was kind of panic buying in the beginning. And one of the problems we faced was we had a record year in the first year of COVID. We really sold a lot of networking equipment, which was great for us. But as the lead times increased, we had already sold the equipment based on the current Rand exchange rate. And obviously the Rand dropped, and we were left with other issues like problems with exchange rate, all of that type of thing. So now we're sitting with issues like we have to be the bank. So we can only invoice clients on equipment delivery, but when we place an order on the vendor, we have to pay the vendor up front. So we might be sitting for 12 to 15 months playing the bankroll. And obviously, from a personal perspective, me in sales, I can only get recognition based on delivery of equipment. So all the deals we do today actually mean nothing until next year. So we're sitting in quite a predicament at the moment, but we are seeing that the vendors are doing all they can to bring the lead times in, and yeah.
So, do you have any sympathy for Dave?
No, I don't.
That was a no, in case you didn't hear. No sympathy whatsoever.
None whatsoever, and I don't have sympathy for anyone sitting on all the OEMs sitting on my left here. And I don't have any sympathy for any OEMs, anyone building anything, because the same way as all the ISPs in South Africa got together against a certain player in the market and changed things, I think there's been no cohesion in the global economy with semiconductor users to say, how do we go about doing this? I think it's been a great excuse for the last 2 years to say we can't deliver, create a stock shortage. The stock shortage, sorry Andrew for your NVIDIA shares, but with stock shortages, prices go up. It's inevitable, whether it's intended or not, that's what happens. So, and in all this time, there could have been some sort of plan to get together, as Ryan says, they're now busy building capacity. But that's 2.5 years later. We could have been a lot further by now. And again, if there was will, with this desire, this could have been done a lot earlier. There are not that many players in the market using silicon at that level. Look at Tesla. They had a problem. Did they stop their deliveries? No. They just changed the firmware on their chipsets to use silicon from anyone. So they weren't tied into Samsung anymore. And so whoever they could get chips from, they got. And you can still buy a Tesla car.
But is globalization going to die, is what you're saying?
Maybe.
Andrew is eager. Yes, Andrew.
I'm going to disagree slightly with Saul, because I actually, sitting on the borderline of this with R&D, I see it from both perspectives. We've been developing certain products, and there's a long lead time when you're writing code. And you write it to specific hardware that you know that you're going to get. Then suddenly you discover, like in our case, I wanted to buy a bunch of dual port 100 gig NICs. It took me 6 months to find any 100 gig NICs. The net result of that was I sat there and I either stop my development because I can't get the hardware to develop on, or I've got to go and redesign the solution so that it works on a software basis to take the silicon out of the equation, which is what we ended up doing, and we got actually fairly similar performance. But the simple fact is that when you do a redesign and a pivot like that, you're not talking about a couple of months here. You're talking about a rewrite of potentially hundreds of thousands of lines of code. And so in one sense, I do have sympathy for the OEMs.
Shame.
But at the same time, I also feel the frustration in the fact that I also am sitting unable to get these components. I mean, if I can't buy network cards from Intel, what the hell hope is there?
I'll buy my 100 gig solution from someone else, thanks, who can do those hundreds of thousand lines of code quickly.
Graham. Mike.
Switch it on, Graham. Yeah, just a question to everybody. I mean, we've mentioned a couple of times the just-in-time JIT kind of methodology. Is this going to kill it? Are we going to finally get inventories and supply up again, or are we just going to go back to JIT when we're done?
I think you're going to see something else happen. I think that you're going to see an adjustment in products to use more readily available silicon. That could have an impact on product stability for a while those adjustments are happening. On the shareholder call that Cisco held for their latest market filings, one of the things that Chuck, the CEO, said was that Cisco had been effectively redesigning entire platforms to use different silicon. Now, that's actually common practice in a lot of vendors. They adjust bits and pieces, but when you're talking about a wholesale redesign here, that can cause stability problems. And the thing is, if you're buying an ASR 9K, you're not sure whether or not you're getting the redesigned version or the old version, so you don't know what the stability is going to be on that product. So I think what you're going to see is an adjustment away from potentially niche silicon, which is being ordered in smaller batches, to more generic silicon. But at the same time, that could have a significant impact on product stability, and you won't even know which version you're getting. That is one of my big concerns.
Ben?
So I think your question can be answered in terms of basic network design, actually. Because just-in-time manufacturing from a queuing theory perspective is the same as doing store and forward with shallow buffers. It's the same thing. From a queuing theory, it's the same thing. And we know as network engineers that works in one of two situations. Either you underutilize your links, you can't run a network hot if you have bursty traffic and shallow buffers, or you tail drop, right? You've got to just be prepared to kill off a whole bunch of orders once every few years when the system gets hot. And if we don't do one of those two things, we're not going to be able to, if the cause of this long tail is because we were running the system too hot, then the only way of recovering is to rapidly build capacity, which sounds like it is happening, although those ramp up numbers sound super ambitious to me. I don't know if I don't know if that's how quickly these things really can happen. I honestly don't know. I mean, maybe 24 months is realistic to build a new fab, but that sounds super quick to me. Or we have to, like, the vendors need to man up and be like, all those orders you placed in the last, 3 years, we are not honoring those orders. We are starting from scratch, place new POs. And other than that, I don't think there is a solution. There isn't in the networking world, and I don't see the distinction in the supply chain world.
So,
I said shame to Andrew a little bit earlier, and let me explain why, because after his last comment, I want to add to that. There was hopefully an interesting talk earlier on about vendor selection, and one of the slides spoke about multi-vendors or a single vendor. So if you're developing anything in this world, and you're tying yourself into one vendor, make sure they can deliver. If they can't deliver, then make sure that everything that you need and manage your risk. Then you need to make sure that from day one, you're developing your software that can cater for multiple silicon manufacturers. And if you don't do that from day one, shame on you.
Xabiso, you want to say something?
Sure. Just to respond to that question, right? The thing with just-in-time, right, is that it brings in some cost efficiencies, to OPEX. You don't have to stockpile however much inventory that you need, and then in turn you don't need to be paying for warehousing, insurance, etc., and that cost then doesn't get passed on to the consumer. I think
They just don't sign new customers, basically.
I love how you're implying that Cisco does cost-plus pricing.
I think I partly agree with what's being said there, in that to sort of like as a customer or as an operator, to sort of maybe mitigate the risk, you need to maybe do away with single vendor reliance, and this is something that OEMs definitely will not advise you on, but do away with single vendor reliance, because that mitigates or it cuts away your concentration risk. So if something goes wrong with one vendor, then you can always swap the problematic vendor with the other one. The second is that don't build your network using vendor-specific features, because in that case, you are basically locked into that one vendor that is able to produce or to offer you that specific feature. So you need to design your network in a standards-based kind of a way. And then thirdly, make sure that the vendors that you use, they are open, they play nice with everybody else, they're interoperable, so that whenever there's an issue, you can always just, as I say, swap out with somebody else.
When you leave the vendor, the truth comes out.
I just really want to respond to what Saul said. So, Saul, I 100% agree with a lot of what you've said, and you can cater to different types of silicon. But here's the thing, there's a cost to doing that. And that cost has to be borne by the people who are going to be the end consumers of the equipment, because someone's got to pay for this. And if I've got to develop something to work on 3 different types of silicon, there is a development cost, and it is not insubstantial. Someone's got to pay for that. The other problem that comes in is that when you are doing particularly development of networking equipment, realize that silicon has different properties and different functionality in it. And what it means is that when you are developing across multiple silicon parts, you're effectively having to then develop to lowest common denominator, unless, as we did, you take the hardware out of it and you go to a software layer system completely. But otherwise, you're ending up in a situation where you are being forced to play to a lowest common denominator. That leaves you with a problem where the competition, who may be far, far bigger than you, may have more delays, but they've also got functionality that you cannot produce because you are protecting your supply chain and your ability to deliver. So it becomes a complex series of trade-offs, and I don't think it's as simple to say just develop for multiple silicons, because A, it's got a cost, B, it can impact functionality, and someone's got to bear the results of that.
Yes, Werner.
I think, first of all, I can appreciate what Andrew said about building for various different silicons. But even doing that doesn't help us, right? Because the problem lies in the fabs, and there's only a handful of fabrication plants because it's so complex. So even if you try and use other silicon, you need to go back to the fab to actually manufacture that silicon, and that's where the big issue lies at the moment. Right, it's not the chip that you're using, it's actually, you can design a new chip, you can use another chip, but at the end of the day, someone needs to manufacture it, and that's the problem.
Everyone was called to the pants down with the chip shortage. If 75% of the chips coming from the east was, we let that happen. 30 years ago it wasn't that. So we let the east take over the semiconductor market. What's going to be happening now is that that's not going to happen now. As for the CHIPS Act that's come out in America now, there's going to be geodiversity of that semiconductor supply chain. So it won't happen immediately. It's going to take a while, but in the future, that geodiversity, we won't be caught with our pants down with everything coming from the east. We've got our own manufacturing facility. So would we manufacture the high-end optical semiconductors? Our problem is still with the semiconductors for things like power supplies and fans. That's where we're struggling with. But we do have our own facility in California. The CHIPS Act will help. It'll help us to scale up in that facility we've got. And it'll also help us with our research as well to maybe move some of the research away from the east back over to the west.
And even
It's ask you a follow-up question. You're saying that creating new fabs in the States is going to create geodiversity. At the same time, is that not just kicking the can down the road on the supply of the raw materials? Because the raw materials are still coming from a limited number of places. Neon gas is very concentrated in the Ukraine. A lot of the silicon and certain components of that are very concentrated in the DRC of all places. And we know that, wars happen in Africa, etc. So yeah, you can say that you're creating geodiversity in the fabs, but is that not just kicking the can down the road for the next natural disaster that hits the raw materials?
It doesn't mean it's not worth.
Paul, and Paul at the back. Wait, Paul, wait.
Yeah, to be a little bit controversial, but quite simply, when we talk about just in time, was it maybe running a little bit hot, but the system was still working, it was creaking, and now that disaster struck, the system topped over. Quite frankly, before COVID, there were orders being dropped. There were implications. It just wasn't affecting the sectors which were adversely affected. Saul mentioned Tesla went out and changed suppliers and so on and so forth. The crux of that example is people are prepared to pay a shitload of money for a Tesla. So Tesla was able to go, we're taking the price. If Juniper or Cisco were to say, you know what, we want all the silicon we need, we're prepared to triple the price of our hardware, then they wouldn't have the supply problem. There's always going to be dropped orders. It's just when dropped orders affect your industry, or when dropped orders reach a point at which they're starting to congest the supply chain, that we start being as concerned as we are. So there are a couple of solutions. One of them is triple the price of everything. That would solve the resource problem as well if you're prepared to pay more. But the other one is just to accept that these things have a cyclical nature, and this is going to be a pain in the ass for the next couple of years. And unfortunately, I think in particular with networking equipment, unlike the graphics card industry, which sort of took the price plunge early on, shipped up prices, and the glut followed them. I mean, if there wasn't the glut on the graphics side of things, there wouldn't be as much of a hardware problem here now. The automotive industry, everybody got in their point in the queue on the basis of their pricing. And you've got to compete with the MNOs. Those vendors decided to hit in much harder and much faster. So,
Alan?
Hi, my name's Alan Levine. I'm the chairman of the Internet Society of South Africa. Does anybody here speak Chinese? Is anybody here from China?
They're at the airport.
And everything that we're talking about is about supplies coming from China, I believe. No. Oh, so Taiwan's a different place completely.
That depends partly who you ask, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Might be off topic a little bit.
No. We're talking about the price of chips here. Fair I import stuff from China, and I understand what's going on there. Well, to some extent, it's a shambles. And the bottom line is, the equipment that we sold the most of prior to COVID was American Ubiquiti Wi-Fi access points. And I don't know what's happened to Ubiquiti, but it's going down the tubes. The same access points that used to work unbelievably 2 years ago have now got somehow firmware updates that have got them to work worse. Because all the good people that built the Ubiquiti company have left. I'm sorry, I don't have such an optimistic future as you.
So that's where they're coming from now. Nothing against China, just that's where everything is at the moment.
Yeah, it's getting hot here. Ryan, you'll segue us into the next one, which I think is rather appropriate. And I'm sure Werner, Barry, and Dave might be a bit impartial to this one. Xabiso is in between, so it's fine. Sort of transitioning. Are you buying gray gear? And white box falls in that as well, either to mitigate, to add. Gray would fall. I mean,
what's gray? What's gray mean? What is it? What is that? I mean, I can talk a little bit about what WIOCC did, and then it's a bit bigger than that question, if it helps. And I might also move the conversation away from the the global problem to the industry problem. Maybe I could start to talk a little bit about actually what's happening in the subsea systems around Africa. And if you look at the kind of the WIOCC system on the west coast, WIOCC is out of capacity. The next upgrade is still at least a year out and affected by the chip shortage.
I thought the upgrade was a Equiano, but go ahead.
You still need multiple cables, but I mean, Equiano is one part of the solution, but it doesn't go to all the countries that WIOCC goes to. I mean, you can look at it from a South African perspective and say it will solve part of the problem, but it's not going to solve the whole problem right around Africa. On the East Coast, the cables are aging and also filling up. On the Easy cable, which we're part of, there's not a lot of capacity on the cables that go across the Mediterranean. They've all been bought up and also in upgrade processes affected by chip shortages. So what I see until these new cables come is quite a constrained amount of capacity coming into the continent as a big result of this problem we talk about today, and we can start to think about it as an industry. From our side, the way I look at it, and some of the things at WIOCC is we have to get better at forecasting. The lead time on equipment is not going to change anytime soon. All these problems, we can come up with creative solutions You're clearly not a commercial person. You're ready to drop everybody's orders. You've never been in sales before.
Diverse panels.
Exactly. We need to get better at forecasting our networks. We have to have our forecast with our vendors much earlier than we historically have. My vendors talk to me about, can we give them a 6-month forecast? What do we need 6 months from now? Because just to try to get their manufacturing and their processes down to somewhere between 32 and 54 weeks. I mean, we're really at those sorts of lead times with most of the vendors now. So internally, we're trying to get better at the forecasting. It's hard in a wholesale business where you have very lumpy capacity. You forecast 300-400 Gs in advance, and then one cloud operator takes a 500 G order, and then your forecasting is gone. So it's a bit difficult. Yes, grey market stuff is part of the solution. I think anything that's pragmatic and you can trust and it works, and why not? If you can still give the reliability your customers need. Yeah, I think maybe that's a different way to look at the problem. And I'd be interested to see what other operators are thinking about and what the vendors need from the operators to help improve the situation.
So, Andrew, I'll let you go next because I know you have a bit of bashing to do. Barry and Werner, you're going to be up next as OEMs to talk about your feelings on the grey. Andrew.
Look, the way that I look at this is there is grey market equipment out there. And if companies can use that to mitigate their lead times, they should be allowed to do so. The problem here, in at least one case with one particular vendor that I would love to name, but for various reasons I can't.
Can you give us a color?
Grey.
We went out and bought a bunch of grey market switches.
Yeah.
Got really nasty letters from them. Really nasty letters saying you can't do that because of partnership agreements, blah, 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 blah. And the vendors are going to have to realize that if they can't supply, they leave us with no option but to go out and either change vendors or go and buy grey market. But there is a pushback from the vendors that say, you're buying grey market, you can't do that. And then you get pushback from the vendors despite the fact that they cannot supply. And that has to end because that is not fair on the providers that actually need the equipment. And so yes, grey market does definitely have a place, but it cannot be a place that is eliminated by aggressive tactics from the vendors who are still trying to keep their hooks in you.
Barry, a lot of the folk in here are IP folk, so transport is, not the typical day-to-day. Even in the transport world, there's a lot of grey market happening right now, significantly cheaper than if they bought it from, an Infinera, for example. So how do you folk tackle that?
Look, I think the grey market does play a role at the moment because, again, as Infinera, we're more in a partnership with our customers. So when there is a shortage now, I think the grey market has got a role because we do believe that it's a long-term relationship that we've got with our customers. We do see the semiconductor supply chain problems eventually going away, and that's when, obviously, then the grey market hopefully will go away as well. But currently, I think the grey market does have a place to help our customers at the moment.
Werner, so to Andrew's point and also what Barry said a little bit, are you playing any active role in working with the grey market to support your customers, or are you just letting it naturally slide the way it does, or are you getting in the way, or none of the above, all of the above?
Yeah, I mean, as a vendor, I don't think my first suggestion would be to use grey market kit, right?
Well, that's why you're at
because
SAFNOG.
That's the business.
Let's ask the ex-Cisco guy.
But, I mean, customers need short-term strategies and they need longer-term strategies. And as a short-term strategy,
if I'm in a corner and I can't grow my network, you guys need ports and you need capacity and bandwidth. The only way is to look at something like that, and even if it is a short-term strategy, just to get over that hurdle, I'm not going to say no to it, right?
Ex-Cisco guy.
Okay,
Sorry,
sure.
is this being recorded? I shouldn't have said what I said.
So,
Okay, the edit button doesn't work, so.
does the gray market have a role to play? Yes, right. But I would say proceed with caution. You would have to scope out and qualify your use case properly. If you're talking about non-critical, non-complex roles or functions in your network, access maybe, then sure. But if you're gonna take a box that you got from the gray market and then you put it in the core, you're gonna have to know what you're doing. You're gonna need to have the proper skills to support, or maybe have a very strong systems integration partner that you are working with. Because should something go wrong, vendors are not going to support that. OEMs, and they just won't touch it. So yeah, but just make sure that you know what you're doing.
Ben. It's not easy.
I'm trying to find a nice way of saying this.
It's not easy.
You get that the people in this room are paid to operate networks, right? I really take issue. Now, to be fair, it's not just you. It's an attitude that, to a greater or lesser extent, exists in all of the vendors that I've ever interacted with. The idea that network operators cannot be left alone with network equipment unsupervised is, I mean, what do you think I spend my day doing? Yeah, sorry, I had to say that because I find
So,
I find it, there's just
okay,
quickly, but the point I actually wanted to make is I wanted to go back slightly to what Ryan was saying a second ago, which is that, I mean, whether we solve this by, like, you know, tapping the supply that's available in the grey market, I think that's a side issue. I think the shift that needs to happen between the operators and the vendors is more fundamental than that. And it's about getting much, much better at communicating and forecasting. I mean, my experience of forecasting with vendors is there's this kind of like peacock dance that we do, where like I dangle a slightly inflated number in front of them to get a better price, and they like under promise on lead time in order to look good when they can then over deliver, and everybody's kind of like, everybody's tweaking the numbers a little bit to, like, you know, play with expectations. And that was fine when like a delayed order was in the order of weeks rather than months, and it didn't really have much of an impact in terms of operations. But that's not true anymore. I mean, I had one order in the last year where the initial forecasted lead time was something like 13 or 14 months. And we needed the equipment, but we could kind of make a plan to, like, you know, juggle things around, move some gear around, and, you know, place a quick order on a different vendor and, like, make a plan internally. And so it wasn't a showstopper that it was going to take that period of time. But this particular type of equipment, we weren't quite ready to deploy operationally. We still had quite a bit of work to do internally on internal tools that we maintain in order to integrate this equipment. And so when we were given that number, we were like, okay, that's fine, but that work, that's going way down the list. You know, we've got to scramble to fill this gap. We're going to leave this for 6 months from now. And then the vendor made a plan and brought that lead time back from 13 or 14 months. I think it ended up taking 5.5, 6 months or so. And that was great. And like, it was done for the best possible motives. Do you know what I mean? They wanted to fulfill an order that they knew we needed as soon as possible. They thought that they were being helpful. Now we've got a bunch of equipment that we haven't done the work to operationalize. It's sitting in its box still. And because we had to, you know, we got that news about 2 weeks out before it was about to arrive. We then had to unscramble all of our planning in order to bring the work back forwards. And that's created more that's created more confusion and difficulty planning than the original kind of 30 months was going to create. I think we need to be much better as operators of providing good, realistic forecasts, and we need to, you know, I struggle to stick to my forecasts like you described. It's a hard job. One of the things that I can't do that forecasting without, though, is being unable to get a reasonably accurate timeline pre-purchase order. Getting a ship date with any sort of reasonable accuracy after the purchase order, that's already too late, right? Because, you know, if that's, you know, an order of magnitude longer than I expected it, or an order of magnitude shorter than I expected it, I've got to rethink the order on the basis of that information. So we've got to find a different way of working together to get that planning done that doesn't involve this silly peacock dance.
So,
I think firstly one's got to realize that many of our networks are driven by our customer needs. So planning and forecasting is fantastic, but getting your forecasting wrong is the best possible problem to have, because it means suddenly you've signed up some new customers, you've won a tender to deploy a 100-site network or a 500-site network around the country, or you've suddenly got a whole bunch of big new customers that have come on board. Great problems to have, but it doesn't help with buying new equipment. I want to come back to, thanks Ben, I don't think you could have said it better about the grain refurb. I just want to differentiate what grain refurb is and just tackle that topic a little bit further. Grey simply means it's procured outside of the channel. So if you're buying a Juniper kit, Cisco kit, anything, instead of buying it in South Africa, you're buying it in a different part of the world, that's deemed grey. It's not fake equipment, it's not new equipment. It comes with this warranty from the vendor in a different country. That's all it is. So coming back to Ben's point, we still know how to use it. It's the same firmware that we're buying it from a local manufacturer. It's not fake, guys.
Sometimes it's fake.
It depends where you're buying it from, but it depends where you're buying it from. If you're buying it from a reputable dealer,
in the general cases,
a reputable person buying stock, why can't the OEM dealers in this country source that same stock? Juniper's, Exxon, whoever, sorry, not Exxon, but Juniper, Arista, Cisco, head office is getting that money anyway, whether they're getting it from the EMA region, Africa, Asia, the money's going to them. So why don't you guys source the stock for us in the first place, instead of making us go and get grey? If the pricing is wrong in the continent, that's why we go grey. Refurb is a different discussion. That's that second-hand kit that's been generally end of sale, been beautifully refurbished and renovated, and it looks new. But we're not talking about that in this discussion. We're talking about, and it comes back to what Paul was saying, pay more. We're paying more on the grey market to get the kit straight away. I had kit recently, we were given over a year ETA, but 8 months to a year. Grey market. It was only about 10 or 20% more expensive, but we get it in 6 weeks. From a year to 6 weeks for genuine warranted kit. And lo and behold, the person who's actually where the distributor here outsources that warranty to the same person that our vendor was going to outsource the warranty to. So where's the risk, guys?
And so Dave, and I think while Dave is going through, I'd like to ask the floor to think about your experiences with grey refurb markets and, you know, contribute to that after Dave and Andrew have spoken.
Sorry, just to add to that.
Okay.
Don't forget, when we, as ISPs and network operators, we're buying redundant equipment anyway. We can't wait for any sort of SLA to repair kit. So if a piece of equipment gets broken, it's not like we're sitting without something in that interim, because we can't wait for an engineer to log a TACAX query. We can't wait for something to be repaired. We've got to have spares. We've got to carry spares and have everything in a redundant environment. So if something breaks, we've got that capacity already to deal with it, because it's going to take, even if we're buying it locally, it's going to take another year to get a spare piece of equipment.
So Dave, for example, you know, as a distributor sitting in between partners, vendors, and customers, you know, I don't know how tight your partnership agreements are to give you flexibility in going this approach to some degree, because I know, for example, we have bought new gear for Juniper through Exxon, for example, which we can wait for 210 days plus, versus I can get an MX204 in 2 weeks from, some guy in Europe.
So
what's your flexibility in approaching that? Because you're in the middle, right?
So generally, we'll do anything we can to support the customer. And what we've seen in the market is a lot of the grey kit is actually refurbed. So it's sold as grey, but it comes in as refurbed. And the warranty that the grey distribution give you is basically a warranty back-to-back with themselves. So what they'll say is, we will replace the switch for you regardless, and they'll do a back-to-back agreement. But what we've seen is when it comes to general bug fixes or anything with code upgrades that the existing kit can't support, that's when we've seen clients run into issues with refurbed or grey kit. But on the whole, I mean, what we've done to alleviate the situation for a lot of our clients is we've been stockpiling spares collectively in a massive spares pool in different locations. And when customers require kit urgently, we've had to loan them our spares and juggle our spares around until their equipment arrives. So it's almost like we're doing a rotation of spares instead of actually telling our customers to go out and just purchase what they can on the open market.
Andrew.
Expanding a little bit on something that Ben said about forecasting and the rest of it, this also creates another issue when you only get a lead time after you've placed the order, and that comes down to budgets. Because here's the thing, I go and get a budget, and my budget, my financial year runs from March to March. I place an order in March, and I've got my purchase order. But my invoice only arrives in May the following year. Now I've got a problem, because I didn't spend my budget in the last financial year.
So you get a budget cut.
But now I've got to spend money in a budget that I haven't even been granted yet, because I'm getting an invoice from the previous financial year. That can create a real problem, because you end up in a situation of either saying to the company, I really need to carry my budget forward, what I haven't spent, and that's not always so easy to do.
Yeah.
Or you end up going, listen, I'm going to need more budget because I didn't spend the budget last year because they didn't invoice me at the right time because the date on the invoice is wrong. And it can really mess up your entire budget cycles, and that can lead to all sorts of chaos. So decent lead times that are accurate can at least help you decide which financial year this is actually even falling into.
From the floor, any views on this? Graham.
I think it takes a while to wake up. So to respond to Andrew, I mean, I've had the same problem, and even before the current crisis, letting financial people understand the lead times on specialized transmission equipment, just they can't understand that you can't walk into a shop somewhere in Cape Town and just go buy a DWDM shelf. I mean, why is that not possible? And so now we've got to a situation, like you say, where it's now the norm that stuff is crossing financial years, and financial people just, I mean, the mechanisms exist in financial with accrued payments and all the rest of it, and financial people are just so averse to doing any of that. And I think that we've ended up in a society where everything is down to the months and the quarters and maybe is out to the years. But society as a whole is instant gratification. It's happening now. We're looking at it now. There is no long-term planning. There's no, I mean, I haven't heard any big organization talk about a 5-year plan in a long time.
Oh, They exist, trust me.
But in general, people are talking about 12 months into the future. That's people's planning horizon. And going back to Saul's comments about how consumers just instant gratification. We want to order it, we want to buy it, it must be here tomorrow. We want to place an order. And that's tangential to being able to create any kind of forecasting, because people will, on a whim, on a trend that's happening, some new game that's attractive, some new app that works on one particular device. I mean, we're not talking in the consumer space, but we know that the consumer space is what's driven this. And how do we get that mindset? Do we change that mindset, or do we just suck it up and
That's tomorrow's keynote.
We suck it up.
Okay, sure. Paul, you can take the mic meanwhile, while Xabiso.
Very quickly, right. I suppose all OEMs, right, they have like accredited distributors, distribution partners that they work with. And the reason for that is because if there's an accredited distribution channel, you can guarantee the credibility of the product or the box that flows from there. We had an issue just not so long ago. I just can't remember where the guy is from. He was selling stuff on his online shop, professing that or marketing that it is Cisco hardware, only to find out that it is fake. So this is also for the protection of the end consumer. The second thing is that when it comes to support, there are OEMs have support contracts with customers, right? And those contracts usually have serial numbers of hardware, of your install base tied to them. So if you procure something from the gray market and you find that it is not part of that, or it cannot be tied to any support contract, it's difficult for the OEM to support that because we can't guarantee where it comes from. That's why probably, I don't know, depending on the contract that you have with your OEM, every year, 3 years, 5 years, you will have renewals that are happening, support contract renewals, because you currently have install base that is not end of life, and you want to renew the support for that, and that includes all of the contracts tied to that install base. So that's part of the reason why we can't really touch something that's been procured from the gray market.
Paul.
I'm going to come in and I'm going to start by making a comment that's directed at the vendors, and so I'm joining in on the shitting on the vendors parade, but then I'm going to put a question to the operators, which is, a couple of years ago before lockdown, I was at an event, and AT&T and Verizon and TELUS were talking about how great it is that they're getting into software-defined networking more ambitiously. They're doing Open RAN, and everything is great, that we're no longer being treated like babies by the vendors. We are actually developing in-house capability, and it's more of a partnership, and we're not being told what to do by the vendors. If mobile network operators are grown up enough to be able to be treated like adults by vendors, how the hell are we letting the guys who've been doing this for the last 40 years suddenly be tied to that old sort of turnkey, the vendor holds your hand and tells you what to do mindset? It's just complete and utter nonsense to hear that while the rest of the world has moved towards a more, if you're big and ugly enough to buy the equipment and you can shoot yourself in the foot, then you are entitled to do so. But that does lead to one question which came up about this gray material, which is not refurbed, and refurbed equipment and so on and so forth. Are the network operators prepared to, if you source gray equipment that is under warranty, take responsibility for making sure that it's warranty? If you purchase refurbished equipment, having done the maths and working out that it suits your purposes, Are you big and ugly enough to say to your vendor with whom you've got a normal contract, yes, this is our problem. If we shoot ourselves in the head with this, it's our problem? Because if you can answer yes to that question, then I don't see how there is an issue other than the vendors having a shitty mindset, frankly.
All right, so now we're at the end of the panel, so I'll ask everyone, starting from Andrew, coming all the way back, to comment on that and your final thoughts.
Okay, so firstly, my comment on that is, yes, I mean, quite frankly, when I'm buying equipment, a vendor once told me, I asked a particular vendor why support contracts were so high, and they looked at me and they said, well, we run your network. And I'm like, in your wildest dreams you do. From my perspective, I believe in a situation that operators must be able to, well, operate. I also believe that there has been a tendency over the last 2 decades of vendors creating what I call vendor engineers, which means that when an operator wants to switch from vendor to vendor to go and buy to alleviate this problem, etc., they have a problem. Because they don't hire network engineers, they hire vendor engineers, because your CCIE knows how to operate Cisco CLI but doesn't understand anything about actual networking. Because the vendor training is designed to create vendor engineers rather than network engineers. That's on us as operators for accepting that situation. We've got to go and start hiring network engineers to allow us to move vendors and switch at will, because it's all just syntax if you know the networking underneath it. But yes, I am prepared to accept that risk. I think that it's going to be a long time before we get back to what was normal, if ever. And I think that you are going to see a move to more generic things that are more easily switchable, etc. I think you probably are also going to see a lot more multi-vendor networks, which quite frankly I think is good for the market, because it's going to mean that we go back to having network engineers instead of vendor engineers, because quite frankly vendor engineers should not be in this market because it is bad for the market. Go and learn networking, not vendor syntax. And as a final question that I have to ask for our ex-Cisco friend there, you keep referring to fake hardware. Please, define for me fake hardware, because last I checked, you can't install an iOS image on some other silicon. And if it installs iOS, and it says Cisco on the front of it, and it's running Cisco iOS, other than in the case where you could install Cisco on Howie equipment years ago, it's not fake. It's still Cisco hardware.
That was a feature, not a bug.
So please tell me, what is fake hardware? Because I'm not buying this term.
Dave.
So as a systems integrator, we'll support you 100% regardless of the underlying tin.
Barry?
I think, as I said, with the grey market, there's a place for it. In the perfect world, it wouldn't be there. There's a place for it now at the moment. In the future, hopefully, the operators won't be going to the grey market, but there's a place for it now.
Werner.
Yeah, it's not an easy problem to address, right? Because, like we said, now you need to, in some cases, rely on that because you need equipment right now. But from the vendor's perspective, it's just about, we don't know where the hardware really came from. And at Arista, we really try and track every single serial number and link that to a customer. So if you do get a great product, it just means it didn't come by that channel and probably has been used before. And we can't do quality control on that product from another customer, right? That box could have been dropped. It could have a faulty component and someone else just sells it because they want to get rid of it and you buy it and you think this product is a bad product because it's not performing as the rest of the products. So it's not an easy thing to solve, but yeah, good ideas came out of it.
Xabiso. And I think the main focus for you is what is fake hardware?
I agree with everything that he said. Everything that he said. I agree with that. In terms of just final thoughts, right? Also, I just don't want to reiterate of what I've already said before, but again, operators just de-risk your networks, reduce concentration risk, adopt a standards-based approach in terms of network design, and also just make sure that whatever you procure, you get from your vendors or your suppliers, make sure they're open, they play nice with everybody else, there's interoperability, etc. In that way, that's going to mitigate the operational pain points whenever there is such a disruption as we are facing today.
Brian.
Okay, so as a wrap-up, as entertaining as this debate has been, the religious debate about grey equipment and etc., I think it's one small component of the problem we're talking about, right? If you look at the problem we've got, equipment's going to be delayed. That's full stop, that's happening. So the question is, what were the solutions we talked about? It's a combination. Yes, grey market equipment is part of that solution, like it or not. There's a commercial reality between the vendors and the network operators, which is clearly come out here, but that's going to play out. There's also the innovation. I think Saul and Andrew actually were saying the same thing. You've got to innovate. One from an engineer saying it costs a lot, and you're saying from a buyer, I need to buy it from the cheapest place as quick as I can, and there's going to be competition and innovation. So innovation and competition are part of the solution. Something I also said in the beginning that we're going to have to deal with is this, the shark, the big fish, the smaller fish, the tiny fish, and the shrimp. There's definitely a pecking order in the buying chain, and as operators, we need to understand where we are in that pecking order and try to figure out how we can go up in that chain. So, I've been exploring buying clubs on some of the new subsea systems, that sort of thing, and European backhaul, those sorts of things, to see if we can move up that pecking order. And then the only other thing is again, the forecasting needs to be good. And finally, I don't know how you do your CapEx budgets, but for me, a CapEx budget is just a cash flow forecast. If you sign an order, you're going to have to pay the cash when it's delivered, and your finance guys better have that cash. Or you're either going to run out, or you can lend some more, I guess.
Ben.
Yeah, I think that was a really good summary. So I think just coming back to the kind of the aftermarket, the aftermarket equipment question. I think where this overlaps with the shortage that we're currently seeing is that is a potential source of supply. And we're being told that a large part of this situation that we're facing at the moment is a supply side problem, but we're leaving a large amount of supply on the table. And look, 10 years ago, I think the arguments that are made by vendors about the difficulty, the lack of supportability for refurbished and non-approved distribution channel equipment had some validity. But we've solved most of those problems now. We have much less tight coupling of code and system architecture. We have ways of cryptographically verifying that systems haven't been modified after they've been manufactured. We've solved all of those problems. I mean, approved distribution chains, let's call a spade a spade. Like, they are today a price control mechanism to make sure that vendors are able to offer differentiated pricing in different markets. And there's, in ordinary times, I have no fundamental problem with that. I'm not suggesting that we all put our red berets on and parade down the hall. But I think we should be honest about that. And with the current situation, I think it would be a very good idea for all of us, and I think we'd all make more money to work out how the price control imperatives that exist within vendors, which are genuine considerations, can coexist with tapping that additional supply, rather than just sticking to the old mantras of, oh, but someone may have dropped it. I might have dropped it. I may have dropped the box, re-racked it, and then opened a TAC case. Doesn't have to change hands for that to happen. You'll never, ever know. I may have done... I
knew it, Ben, I knew it.
I have opened at least one TAC case, Cisco, I think, where I had dropped it and told them I'd dropped it, and they still took the RMA. So they're fine with it, actually.
So,
I think Ryan's done a great summary, but I just want to answer Paul, and then I'll conclude. The reality is, running a business, running an ISP specifically, you can't rely on warranties. Your network has to be designed around equipment going bad, something will break. Warranties are actually meaningless. So if it's grey and your vendor can't supply a warranty, who cares? Because there's no stock in the country, there's no stock overseas. Yeah, and even in the perfect world before COVID, there was no stock available. So warranties mean nothing. My colleagues run my network, not my vendors. And they're able to work on any operating system, whether it's Junos, whether it's Cisco, Microtech. They can't work on Arista yet, but that's just a matter of time, probably. Well, exactly. They haven't worked on it yet, but it's all the same, and that's the point. So we're not tied. We believe in buying the best product for the right solution, not vendor-specific. One thing to end off with is that we're selling milk. Same way as milk on a shelf, if it's not sold that day, it goes off. If an internet packet isn't used today, you can't use the same internet packet tomorrow because there's other stuff. Customers buy services because they want to use it. If we don't sell something today, you can't sell it again tomorrow. Tomorrow's opportunity to sell other things. And what we've sold today, in a week's time or 2 weeks' time, the technology has changed. There are other things on the market, there are other more exciting things that our customers are going to want to buy. But we've missed this opportunity of delivering what we could have done today.
and on that note, it's been an excellent panel. Thank you very much. Portia.